Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us again on this wonderful program where we talk to Professor Bolaji Akinyemi about burning international issues. And today is a very special day because we're going to be dealing with a topic that actually started in our very first interview when we talked about COVID 19 and the response we were getting from national leaders. And Professor Kemi muted the point regarding the fact that uh, long term planning was something that was missing and had obviously had an impact in how nations were dealing with issues like the COVID 19. And this also started to crystallize out as we started to see that a lot of nations that have demonstrated economic progress and that have emerged or reinforced their position as superpowers are not necessarily the nations that we will regard as democratic nations. So we thought to explore that topic a little bit more, where we look at democracy versus development. Is democracy starting to fail us? And is democracy now something that is hampering nations of the world from moving on developmentally? And today we have with us Dr. Vanessa Iwowo, who is going to be with us to discuss this topic. She's written this academic paper that addresses the point leadership in Africa and rethinking development. Dr. Iwo, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
All right. So, this academic paper you have written, what led you to write this?
Thank you very much. I wrote that paper. That paper is actually an spring of my initial doctoral thesis, which I concluded in 2012. And that paper was written years down the line. But the initial thinking was as a young scholar, I was very much interested in the study of leadership and the theories of leadership. But I was also more perplexed by the fact that all the voices that appeared to speak to this issue of leadership and define leadership appeared to come from a particular part of the academy, the Western academy. And many of the theories and concepts of leadership that were being brandished and were being taught, even in our business schools, because I'm a product of the business school, were mostly framed by Western perspectives. And it troubled me because, as a critical leadership scholar, I belong to the critical management studies division. And as a critical scholar, I thought we're taught that you see from a point of view. And so my question at the time was, if indeed we see from a point of view, then whose point of view are we looking at this social phenomenon that is called leadership from? And this is what sparked my interest as a scholar and actually led to the birth of that paper, to the writing of that paper. So I was saying, within my argument at the time was, there are a multiplicity of perspectives, and I do not think that we have looked at leadership from every possible angle in order to be able to standardize what its practice should be. And this is of particular concern for those who do leadership development, because I found that the go-to was really to take management development textbooks from the West and apply it to the African context. And I had a problem with that.
Uh, Prof, I know that you have been in leadership positions almost all your life, and like we've said time and time again, you've risen to the top echelons of this. Do you recognize what Dr. Igbowo is talking about?
Yes, I do. And let me start off by saying I regard it as a privilege to finally meet her, not personally or electronically personally, because I have come across her views in some of the things that she has written. And it's a privilege for me now to have an opportunity to get into this dialogue with her, learn more, and as she's sharing her views with people in the audience, she's also educating me and sharing her views, with me. Because first of all, having been the foreign minister in a developing country, you get torn between the pressures coming from the West and the pressures coming from the East. With each bloc interpreting what you are trying to do from their own perspectives. They never, at any particular time, think that there is an African perspective. It's either it's under the influence of the Soviet Union, it was still Soviet Union at that time, or it's under the influence of Washington. And I will spend a long time telling them there is an African perspective and that is where I'm coming from. But frankly, I could never get my views across. Unfortunately, I was a foreign minister when Margaret Thatcher, who was a British nationalist to the core, was prime minister in Britain, and Ronald Reagan was the United States president, again, another American nationalist. Trump didn't start this America first. Go back to Ronald Reagan. And so being caught in between these two and trying to tell them Nigeria has a point of view. I wish that Dr. Iwowo's paper was around at that time. I would gladly have distributed it to the White House. And number 10, as the intellectual basis for some of the things one was trying to do. But it's a pleasure, to finally meet you, Dr. Iwowo.
Thank you very much.
I, it is still a continuing debate because, in a way, you are not just talking about an intellectual perspective. You are, in fact, talking about a power perspective. People will feel that whoever wins this debate has a power-driven objective. Let me explain what I mean. I was a postgraduate student in the United States at the time when China was just coming up. And you should listen to the kinds of adjectives that were used to describe China. They were insulting. As if, well, who are they? Where are they coming from? Well, what can they do? But the day that China exploded its atomic weapon, the first test it did, people sat up in Washington, and I'm sure people also sat up in 10 Downing Street. Use the same illustration for India and Pakistan. They were regarded as third world countries, poverty-driven, of little contribution to the international system. When they became nuclear powers, they were now treated with respect, and their views and their perspectives now became input into the international system. So the only way that an African perspective is going to be given audience and respect is going to be when it is driven by a power perspective.
Dr. Iwowo, you looked at Africa in particular, and one of the questions that comes to my mind is this. When you look at Western education, you look at the way we have management consultants that have packaged their way of leadership and have brought that into Africa. In your studies, have you found anything in the African context that we can package and then say, this is the African way of doing leadership, and it is exportable to other places?
Thank you very much. A few African scholars already have, I'd like to say thank you very much to Prof for his comments on the paper and the usefulness and relevance. I think it's a privilege to also interact with you and learn from you. Thank you very much for that. I also wanted to, leading on from the moderator's question, I would say a few scholars already have gone ahead, with presenting the African perspective to the wider context, the wider global context. And I'll give you an example. In South Africa, and I did mention this in my paper, in many parts of Southern Africa, there is a word called Ubuntu, which is interpreted, I am because we are. Essentially, it is African traditional philosophy, and it is found across the sub-Saharan African context in many different ways. I'll give you an example. In Igbo land, it is referred to as Ichiwanni, that is to look out for your brother or your sister. In Shona and in Zulu, it is the right hand washes the left, and the same is true of the other. The word used in many parts of Southern Africa is Ubuntu. That is, if it is from the root word Bantu people. So Ubuntu meaning all of us. Person is a thing to others. And this is essentially the African way of doing things. Another expression of that of that paradigm is a person. You need to be careful. Throw stones at place lest you hit your relatives. I scratch your back. It takes a whole village to raise a child. All of these are expressions of the same thing. But Ubuntu is the word that has been very much discussed and popularized in terms of academic discourse in African scholarship. And there is a book by, I think it is Professor Mbigi from Zimbabwe, and he wrote on the Ubuntu as an agent of African leadership transformation. So that is one perspective that we as African scholars are beginning to take out there, and the world is starting to sit up and take notice. An example of Ubuntu in practice was the Truth and Reconciliation Committee post-apartheid. That was one of the reasons South Africa did not burn after all of the atrocities of apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee was set up essentially and basically on the principle of Ubuntu. And the Ubuntu really is driven by sociocultural values of reconciliation, reciprocity, social sensitivity, and all of this philosophical consciousness when you bring that to the practice of leadership. And I do talk a bit about this in my paper. And you see that in our everyday, even back in Nigeria, you see that in our everyday. For instance, say an employee has been problematic and he's sacked. And the next day, you find him come to the office to see the Oga or the CEO in quote with his mother and his father and his grandmother, and they all kneel down to beg. That is something that is straight out of the African context. Now,
but doctor,
yes,
isn't that the root of corruption in the African context? In fact, in any context, I know you know me. You've done something to break the rules, but because your father comes in or your mother comes in, we overlook it.
This is interesting because there is a counter argument to that. I'm sure Prof will find this interesting. For colonialism to occur, the basic indigenous systems had to be inferiorized. This is an argument, a core argument in that paper. And so all of our connectivities and communality, which is what Ubuntu really thrives on, were one of the first things to go in the colonial project. So the idea that, because if you look at it, the primary root of identity or affiliation of the African is in his tribe and his clan. This is
Hold
something
that
that is
thought. Hold that thought.
originally
Let me get Prof to respond to this thing.
Okay.
Sir, what is your response to this? This Ubuntu thing, is that not the root of corruption?
Well, I was enjoying the interface between the two of you because there is no concept that does not have both a negative and a positive side. No concept. Socialism does. In fact, one could even say that capitalism imported corruption into the African system. However, let's put it this way. There is no concept that does not have a value system which incorporates punishment. I mean, that's why we even before the British came, we had judges, elders who would form a judicial council and impose punishment for infractions of the value system. So there is no doubt that the moderator is right, that this could promote corruption. However, the best way to address that is to have a punishment system that punishes rather than rewards corruption or infraction of the value system. On the other hand, Ubuntu could also lead to dictatorship, where the man knows it all, the big man knows it all. He can override, in fact, he determines, rather than the society now, the value system. And during the first generation of African leaders, Nkrumah, Kaunda, Sekou Touré, we did have a one man rather than a one society driven political system. Whereas in Tanzania, under Julius Nyerere, you actually did have a one value rather than a one individual driven system. So there you are. The same concept could breed corruption, but the same concept could also help to build a solidified society with its values around. Till today, even in Tanzania, I think it's still a one-party system. I'm not sure, but that one-party system limits the term of the president and allows for rotation between the old Tanganyika and Zanzibar. So
I'm going
that
to come back to that point, Prof, regarding the term of our leaders. But before we do that, I want to ask Dr. Iwowo a question based on something you said there, because she references it in her paper here, which is where some earlier studies had looked at the role of an individual leader. Is it truly possible to have leadership that doesn't center around one individual who is able to inspire other people?
Yes, it is. And if you throw back to ancient African society, these were actually the systems we had. If you look at old Oyo Empire, for instance, I think you have the Oyo Messi. You look at even in the old Benin Empire, you have the Council of Elders. So there was the Oba, or there is the paramount ruler, and there's a Council of Elders, a decision-making council. So governance in traditional African society has always been devolved. So this era of dictatorship started to creep into African society during the post-independence era, because there were the images of nationalist saviors who, though wrought independence, but very quickly became dictators in their own states, because it was a question of, I am going to save you from the white man. And so there was that extreme. But throwback to ancient African society, governance was actually devolved. We had the paramount rulers, we had the elders, we had the age grades, we had the women, we had the youths who were mostly warriors. So society functioned in a manner that was, if you like to say, democratic, although I also have a problem with that word, but for want of a better word. Society functioned around and there was a village square, or the town hall, we call it today, but village square, where voices of young, old, least, and great were heard. So this is the structure that when the colonialists came, this is the structure they met, and this is why they could exploit that structure, the cracks, whatever they were in that structure, through the divide and rule and setting up warrant chiefs, where these systems were not particularly strong, or where people had already started to develop agitations against those systems. But what I'm trying to say here is that governance in ancient African society was already devolved and was very, very successful. Even in parts of, I think, Cameroon and East Africa, and East and Central Africa, there was a stoning ceremony. I've read about instances where, if a king or a paramount ruler was problematic, the people took stones, and there was a stoning ceremony in which they had to stone to choose a new king, I think. And if the king wasn't liked very much, he was actually stoned. And if he was the ideal candidate, they dropped their stones and didn't stone him, so he could be crowned. Coronation could proceed. But this is an extreme case. But this is a throwback to ancient African society. There were ways of governance that were devolved. So the idea of dictators post-independence, around the independence era, from what I can.
I think Prof wants to say something there.
Yes, may I say something? I mean, I basically agree with all that Dr. Iwobo has said, but I would like to introduce a little modification, because she said after independence was where this dictatorship crept in. And I was going to say that, no, it was actually the colonial authorities who brought in dictatorship, because having met the democratic setup that you described, they replaced it with the colonial governor in the capital, district officers at the district level. They consulted with nobody and simply passed down instructions.
That's right.
And this went on until the eve of independence. So there was no time that they exposed the emerging African leaders to the democratic values of the past. At Independence Day, you now say, here you are, you have democracy. But what democracy? The new prime minister was used to the colonial governor even being able to override the decisions of, the assembly, district officers simply saying the decision from Lagos or from London or from Paris is this. So really, dictatorship was what was inbred into us during the colonial period. And this is probably why it was easy for the people you described as the savior generation to simply walk into the colonial governor's office and assume the powers of the one-man rule.
Wow. Wow.
I completely agree with that. Yes, I was going to, which is why I talked about warrant chiefs, but that is true. That is right. It was a follow-on from the colonial systems they made. Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. So, Prof, going back to a point that you touched on, or you were about to touch on, in terms of how long leaders stay in position for. I think that in Africa, we're so used to leaders who will be there 15, 20 years. And, everybody kicked at it and said this person is trying to stay there for life. But in the last week, we've started to see Russia, for example, and the Russian president now putting in reforms that mean he could be in power till 2036. What is your response to that?
I was I was we're not surprised, but let me just say I was fascinated by the Russians who were interviewed as to why they voted for Putin. And they said he has made Russia great again. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was down in the pits. Everybody marching all over Russia. And that even internally, Russians, the oligarchs, stole blind the resources of the country. And that now you had this man who had come and had built up Russia. They are so proud now to be Russians, and that he has also addressed some of the economic issues that faced a collapsing Russia. And that was why they were voting for him to continue. And when you look at the difference between Obama and Trump, don't you wish Obama had continued in office?
Mm-hmm.
You could, having a dictator who is driven by the national interest can actually be an advantage to a developing country. Were you surprised that of all the countries in Africa south of the Sahara, only Rwanda is being allowed to come into the European Union now? And Rwanda is not a democratic country. Their president is a benevolent dictator. Let's put it that way. But all the rest of us who are too focused on election in 4 years' time, election in 2 years' time, we're all messing up our countries that we are not even regarded as being allowed to come into the European Union. So I'm fascinated by the concept of a benevolent dictator within the context of a developing country. But let me quickly say this. Before Dr. Iwowo comes in. I had thought that this is something that applies to a developing country. But the streak of dictatorship that practically all prime ministers and presidents have shown in combating COVID-19 actually has allowed me to modify my view that it depends on the issues you are faced with, the problems you are faced with, that calls for the kind of leadership that you need to apply to your country. There's
Well,
no doubt that in Europe, in the United States, a lot of rights have been taken away under the banner of combating COVID-19. And I'm not sure all those rights are going to be returned.
well, Dr. Iwowo, the way I want to look at this is this. November, December 2019, Harvard Business Review released a report where they looked at the top 500 companies by market capitalization in the United States. And they found out that the average tenure of the top companies in that top 500 of their CEO was about 15 years. So the longer the period, the better for the organization economically. And I assume for them to have stayed there, they've been doing well for the company. Do you see such a model transferring to national leadership in an African context?
Thank you very much for that. Thank you also for Prof, for your insights, because that got me thinking. However, I have one question, maybe to add to that. If that's the case, then why did we have a problem with Robert Mugabe? And why do we have a problem with Museveni of Uganda? Because, and where are these criticisms really coming from? Because if if a Western or a country like the Soviet Union, Russia, can Putin can do what they did and tweak the constitution so it stays extended to 2036, then what really was the fuss with Mugabe? And we need to begin to interrogate what were the forces that sabotaged Mugabe's government. I mean, what were the forces and what were the forces that undermined Mugabe's government? Because Mugabe was a savior. If you remember the land issue in Zimbabwe, he was a savior of sorts, an African savior. So I think it is hypocrisy, really, for the West to turn around and say the same thing that Mugabe and people like Museveni, are living out within their own context. I'm not saying it is right, but I agree with Prof that the leadership required for any country or any context will be determined to a large extent by the issues that attend to that particular national context. So I think it is hypocritical for the West to the reports from HBR, Harvard Business Review, to sanction or to say that this is good, when in an African context it becomes bad.
So what is interesting to that point, if you look at the last 5 presidents of the United States, Bill Clinton did 8 years, George W. Bush did 8 years, Barack Obama did 8 years. Trump is there. We don't know what's going to happen in November if he's going to win. You look at the United Kingdom, Tony Blair was there for 10 years. Margaret Thatcher was there for 11 years. And this, for me, starts to reinforce this concept that says what we have in Africa is probably something that may have been as a result of the context of Africa. And that not necessarily sanctioning somebody who wants to continue to be there, like the government is their personal property. But it's also saying, let us review these thoughts in the context of development. Is it helping us? If you look at these United States, maybe Russia will get there now. We're seeing the same thing.
Yes.
We're seeing exactly the same thing. Prof, what do you have to say to this?
Well, no, I was going to Dr. Iwobu ask a question, but then it ended up being a rhetorical question because she started to answer it. There is no way the West could have allowed Mugabe to succeed because of the land issue in South Africa itself. Zimbabwe was not, they've written off Zimbabwe, but they were not going to allow the way Mugabe handled the land issue in Zimbabwe to be replicated in South Africa. Therefore, they had to make sure that he failed. In a way, they set a trap for him. I was involved peripherally, I must say, during the Lancaster House conference on Zimbabwe, and the British government promised that they were going to make funds available for land reform in Zimbabwe that will allow Zimbabwe to pay the white
Farmers.
landowner for land which they stole in the first place. They stole it without, any compensation, but that they will pay, and they didn't pay. They reneged on that, and Mugabe kept reminding them of the promise, because you will notice that Mugabe did not seize the land immediately after independence. He waited for almost 20 years, if not more. But when finally it was like they were determined to demystify Mugabe in the presence of the Zimbabwean, that Mugabe then decided he has to do something about this land issue. And they were also prepared to make sure that he failed by the economic sanctions they imposed on, exploitation of his tobacco and all the other things. So you are right. It's hypocritical, but it is hypocrisy that is driven by hard-headed analysis of their own strategic interests in South Africa. They were lucky with, I hope I'm not going to offend our viewers by saying this. Mandela was more interested in pleasing the white establishment in South Africa than in advancing the interests of the black South Africans. And all the riots and the xenophobia you are starting to get in South Africa, which first of all Zuma and now Ramaphosa is facing, actually the seeds were laid by Mandela. Mandela should have insisted that at least in terms of percentages, there must be economic returns to the blacks for all they suffered under the apartheid regime. He never did. People have said it was more important that he will have a stable South Africa. But then for how many years? South Africa has become unstable now.
Wow.
I totally agree.
Oh, wow. Okay. There's a question here that I need to pose to the two of you. I think, Dr. Iwowo, I'll let you go first on this, because we're looking at the impact of Western education on Africa and how this has affected the African mindset, where we think that if something doesn't come packaged from the Western world in terms of knowledge, it's maybe not as good. And that might have been inflicted on Africa by that whole colonial mentality. We get that. But you are a product of the system. Prof is a product of the system. The best of the institutions here, the best of the institutions in the United States. Dr. Iwowo, I'd ask you this first. How have you been able to protect your African identity from being influenced by this kind of westernized education?
2 words: intellectual outreach. 2 words: intellectual outreach. Because, first of all, when I was a little girl, in my social studies curriculum, I went to primary school in Nigeria. I was told that Mungo Park discovered the mouth of River Niger. As an academic and as a young scholar, I wondered what all the people who lived around that area, who washed their clothes in there and who cooked there, what they knew about the River Niger, and if or not, whether or not they did not exist. And I realized that the colonial period did not only do political damage, it did a lot of ideological, intellectual, and mental damage, because first and foremost, I realized that you cannot plunder your equal. Like the great Chinua Achebe did say, you cannot plunder your equal, because that leaves you open to plunder. So the first thing you need to do is to organize systems of inferiorization that diminish and undermine your equal so that they no longer are your equal, and make them complicit in their own inferiorization so that you can civilize them. So you cannot civilize them if you don't first call them savage and primitive and then in need of civilizing, which is where the whole colonial project began. And we all know now that under all of that was the same predatory capitalism that threw back to slavery, the commodification of the African body. So for me, it's two words: intellectual outrage. I am a product of that system, but thankfully, I am also a product of our own socio-cultural systems that were inferiorized by the colonial experience. And that gives me the dual perspective and the critical perspective that I bring to this. I look at it and I say, this is imperialist narrativization of history. Stories of colonial conquest told in disciplines of sociology, anthropology, of the natives who didn't know anything and who couldn't represent themselves because they must need to be represented by the white man who had the burden of civilizing them. As a scholar, an African scholar, it is simply outrage. When I come face to face with these things and I realize what a fraud the whole project has been. And I think it is a privilege in my time to be able to not only critique these things, but help unpack some of these complexes and the complexity that attend to a lot of our processes today. Even in Nigeria, we have things like Aba made, and we talk about it with disdain. All of this, they throw back to the inferiorization of everything that was indigenous. And I speak about that a bit in my paper when I talk about what is indigenous. But for me, the answer to your question is intellectual outrage at the fraud and the hypocrisy that were used to justify predatory capitalism that was the colonial project. And at the end of the day, like a Prof has already said, they left us like, okay, over to you. You have independence now. You go on ahead. And no wonder African leadership has floundered in mediocrity because it's neither fish nor fowl. Mimicry, like Baba would say, is not just enough for me to push your pen and make sure Africa is exploited, but not enough to be quite. So I'm like you, but not quite, because you need me to push your pen and make sure that the whole machinery runs. But at the end of the day, I'm not like you. I'm not you because you have ensured that I am neither fish nor fowl. And today, Africa as a continent flounders in mediocrity because we arise in the systems that we once relied upon and that made society work. And then you have made us like you, so we haven't quite made the transition to the other side. And so we're stuck in the middle, and Africa again with all her problems. So that is intellectual outrage. I maintain that very precious. It helps my academic pursuit, and it keeps things clear for me.
We're going to come back to a point you raised there in terms of the capitalistic side of things. But, Prof, do you want to respond to that first question?
Well, yes. Dr. Iwowo has been very lucky. Her generation has been very lucky in the sense that obviously from the beginning, she got exposed to African values, whether in written form or in the way and manner in which it was taught by her teachers or the kind of culture she was exposed to. I'm afraid my generation wasn't that lucky. We were even punished for speaking our language, which was called vernacular. We were punished in the secondary school for doing that. And when the literature that we studied in our secondary school was, Chaucer, Keats, Shakespeare. Achebe hadn't written his books. Wale Soyinka hadn't written his books. Cyprian Ekwensi had, started to come up, but his books were not really even regarded as literature. And in any case, who was going to teach it? Our teachers were British, who didn't even know what, probably didn't understand what Cyprian Ekwensi was writing about. So we were exposed to simply English literature. And then when my generation went to the universities abroad, American professors, British professors who knew nothing original about Africa. As Dr. Iwowo has said, they knew about Mungo Park, discovering River Niger, forgetting it never even occurred to them to ask were there people not living there before Mungo Park, got there. Who were the people who led him, onto that?
But
And
what do
you
you think
continue
about
to
this?
have this.
A body in the United Kingdom issued a paper around 2 years ago.
Mm.
Overseas students add about 20 billion pounds to the UK economy. Dr. Iwowo, how does that make you feel?
It's mixed feelings. Again, I think it is annoying, but I'm a product of the system and also a beneficiary of the system, so I must be careful because I'm also a lecturer within the British academic system. So I need to first of all acknowledge and admit that conflict of interest at the London School of Economics in a visiting fellow capacity, and I'm a lecturer in organizational psychology at the University of London Pepper College. So there is that conflict of interest. I am a product and a prop of the system in a sense, but it is not so much as the transfer of funds that is the issue here. It is the commodification of something. The British education is Britain's greatest export. Okay, and for a long time it had been done the way we know it. Like Prof has said, they were exposed to Shakespeare, and even when you come abroad, it's the same. Yeah, yeah, in the US now, this is what you ought to know, and this is what you ought to learn. So that movement of money from the other side to this side was to come and buy, in a sense, this education that, even though is a way of seeing, has been made mainstream and the center on the back of colonial power and authority. Because there's this saying, old African saying, that until the lions learn to write, history will be told by the hunter. So the disciplines of sociology and anthropology and economics and political science, as we all know it, where we like to argue were imperialist narratives of history, so, constructed into disciplines that we now pay to come and learn. So, however, there is a rise of the critical theory, critical thought school that is calling for the decolonizing of the curriculum, of which I'm a very proud member and activist for decolonizing the curriculum. So, if our students pay that money to come and be exposed to this new project, that's all well and good. So the system is the landscape is changing, and the critical perspectives are coming into the pedagogy here, higher education, and we're here. So even if it's not as annoying as it used to be, because they come here and they see that there is a multiplicity of perspectives. Seeing is a way of not seeing. What used to be like decentering the center, what used to be the center of mainstream is now seen as one voice in a multitude of voices, within a multitude of voices from all around the world. So if that's what they come here to learn and pay all that money to do, fine. But when it was a station where they came to learn the British way of doing things or the American way of doing things as the standardized way of doing things, those days are passing. And that is where the feeling was, it was one of annoyance. But it's changing because they come to engage now. And also, interestingly, they bring with them also experiences that enrich classroom discussions. They bring with them realities, sociocultural realities that people this side of the world are keen to engage with and learn. So it's changing because of all of that change that's happening. It is not as bad as I don't feel as bad as I used to feel.
So going back to our topic,
No, well, hang
looking
on.
at
Hang on, moderator. I think the fact that when our students go abroad, they meet African lecturers in practically all the universities in Britain and also in America now. And they're exposed to their views, enrich them. But keep in mind, however, that they come abroad because the educational system at home has practically collapsed. Parents look out for the interests of their children first and foremost. It's not easy getting the money, especially when currencies have collapsed. to pay for school fees abroad, but it is part of that African tradition. You will make a sacrifice to get your children educated at whatever cost. And this is what really makes them send their children abroad. But it's a good thing. Unlike my time, when there was no African lecturer at Oxford, but now I think there are 2 or 3 Nigerian professors at Oxford. There was no African professor at London School of Economics in my time, but now you have, the likes of Dr. Iwowo, etc. there. So again, you are not losing those children intellectually to the Western system. They are helping to create a global intellectual system of which they are part of it.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So going back to our point and our topic for tonight, which is about democracy or development. It seems like we're ending up with something in the middle that says we need to make sure that development is not at the expense of democracy. Am I right in saying that, Prof?
Maybe you have been a bit too categorical. I will phrase it this way. If you give me a choice between democracy and development, a choice, I'll pick development. But if I can have a system where I can have both democracy and development, of course, I will pick that mix. But if it is democracy and retrogression, no development, a mishmash of development, then please give me, you can keep democracy, I'd rather have development. And after we have become a developed nation or a developed society, with all the respect that comes with it, then we can now start to talk about democracy.
As we start to round up, Dr. Iwowo, do you have some last words for our viewers? This has been an exciting session. I can see some remarks on social media. People are calling this very educative. People are saying this is really fantastic, which is good. Thank you for joining us this evening. Do you have any last words?
Yes, thank you very much. Just to quickly respond to what Prof said and to add 1 or 2 lines, I agree with Prof on that note. We take the case of Rwanda. Kagame, that's not democracy, but again, look at what's happening to Rwanda. Rwanda is rising, and it's not template or textbook democracy, but it is a country that is to be taken seriously now. So thank you very much for that, Prof. I totally agree. And my last words as I go. I just this is a charge to the African mind. I think, and I'm not the first person saying it. People like Ngugi wa Thiong'o have said it. People like Tino Achebe have said it. There's been a lot of intellectual activism in this area, but that I think it is time to consciously begin to decolonize the African mind, because colonialism did create trauma. It did create trauma of processes. It did create trauma of being. It did create social and social-cultural trauma. And this generation will do well to begin to interrogate and unpack and critique some of the practices that we have carried over into our own dispensation, and it will begin with decolonizing the African mind. That's topic for another day entirely, but I think it is time to stop and begin to ask very basic questions. For instance, why would I buy my little daughter a white doll? What am I telling her? And this is not to say white is bad, but this is to say begin to interrogate those aspects of our own identity that have been inferiorized, because this is the problem for the mediocrity that we find ourselves in. It is an identity crisis. We try to dissect a lot of our national problems without considering the aspect of the trauma that colonialism did to African identity. And until we come to terms with that social trauma and that identity trauma, if you don't know who you are, how can you know where you are going? So the psyche was harmed by that experience. The psyche is still being harmed because it is perpetuated in our everyday, in how we inferiorize the things that are indigenous to us, and how we commonize, if you like, commonize these things. West is better, and everything indigenous is local. That's what we say, or RAS in street speak. So I would say it is up to us to individually and consciously begin to decolonize the African mind. Wherever we are, whether in diaspora, whether on the continent, it is important that now we teach our children to do so. That way we can begin to reclaim our identity and rewrite our narrative. Because right now, history is still being told by the hunter.
One question
Well,
here.
I think that is I think that's the job for your generation, Dr. Iwowo, and the generation of the moderator. Fortunately for you, with the movement of Black Lives Matter, a totally new environment is being created where your job is being made easier. You are going to be listened to. Nobody is going to ask you, what is the problem? Because what Black Lives Matter movement has brought up is, one, identification of the problem. Before, Black lives didn't matter, and people will feel you are wasting their time. But now, yes, they now know that there is an issue which needs to be addressed. And who will address them is going to be you and your
Prof,
generation.
we have
Yes, we
one
would love
question online in the 1 minute that we have left. And it is this: are we still not using the Western yardstick to measure whether a nation is developed or not?
No. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think there are certain universal parameters in terms of infrastructural development, in terms of health development, in terms of educational systems. One is not talking about the content of the educational system. We've all agreed we must read Chinua Achebe. We must read Kweyama, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. We must talk about our geographical discovered world, but we must have an educational system. These are the parameters that are universal, and we shouldn't allow politicians to dodge the issue by saying these are Western parameters. Let's not go there.
Fantastic. We want to thank you, our viewers, for being with us today, for the comments online. Please do come back next week. There's going to be another interesting discussion as we talk to Professor Bolaji Akinyemi and as he shares his wisdom with us. Dr. Iwowo, thank you so much for coming, and bye for now.